I have been working to stock up our freezer on some healthy freezer meals, some breakfast options, snack options, and dinner options as well. I know that we're going into a busy season with work and with garden season quickly approaching, so having some of these frozen options ready to go on hand is just going to make life a lot easier if I'm not able to meal prep. So today I'm going to share with you some of the options that I stocked up our freezer with to make things a little bit easier as we go into this busy season. I'm starting out with prepping some sourdough bread, and the recipe that I'm using is a same-day recipe, and it's really convenient if you're trying to obviously get this done in one day versus most recipes that have a longer ferment time. This is a recipe that you can also just put into the fridge after the bread has risen and leave it there for up to 72 hours to do a cold ferment and then bake it from there. But it's a great option to have on hand if you're looking for something that's made a little bit quicker. So I'm starting out with adding in some warm water. I like to do warm water. That's just going to help to speed up the fermentation process a little bit. And then I'm adding in some sourdough starter and some of our honey. Now, I'm not doing a massive batch of this. I can't do gluten. My husband does eat some sourdough, so I'm just doing 2 loaves today. And I know for many of you with bigger families, that would be just a normal batch of bread that you'd make for the week. But both of these loaves are going to get sliced and put into the freezer. I'm also adding in some olive oil. You can substitute in melted butter here and a bit of salt, and then I'll add in my flour. I'm just using plain organic all-purpose flour for these loaves. I just use my hands to mix this together. I'm just looking for a shaggy dough. It doesn't need to be fully mixed together. And then I'm going to cover that with a dish towel and set it aside to rest for about half an hour or so. While the bread was resting, I got started on my gluten-free English muffins that I'm going to use for my breakfast sandwiches. So for these, I am using a gluten-free flour blend. I don't often use a gluten-free flour blend. I usually will just do my own mix of flours like tapioca, millet, and sorghum flour, but I have not been able to perfect a recipe using those. So I'm going ahead and using some gluten-free all-purpose flour today, and I'm adding that to the bowl of my mixer. You can absolutely do this by hand. I'm just using the mixer because I'm doing a double batch today. I'm also adding in some cane sugar, some salt, and some instant yeast. You can do this with active dry yeast instead. The process will just be slightly different. You're going to want to add that into the warm water and milk mixture. I'm getting those dry ingredients mixed together, and then for the liquid component, I'm doing a mixture of milk and water, and I'm looking for that mixture just to be warm. So I am doing the cold milk, and then I'm just topping that off with boiling water. I'll add that liquid mixture along with the melted butter to the dry ingredients and get that mixed together. Now, this dough mixture is going to look quite wet. It is supposed to look like that, and that's what's going to help the English muffins become really light and fluffy. After that bread had been resting for about 30 minutes, I started on my stretch and folds, and I'm going to do a total of 3 sets of that, spaced every 30 minutes or so before it does its bulk rise. Back to those English muffins, I'm transferring that dough mixture out onto a floured surface, and then I will flour my hands pretty well and just press it out. And then you can use either a biscuit cutter, or I'm just using a jar lid to cut them out, or you can honestly just evenly piece this out with a knife and then roll it into balls. Once I have those formed, I'm just transferring them to a baking sheet that I've sprinkled with cornmeal, and I'm going to sprinkle the tops with cornmeal as well, cover them, and I'm going to allow those to rest for about an hour or so before cooking. English muffins are cooked in a pan on the stove instead of being baked, and I find that the best way to do this is over low heat and to cook them for a longer amount of time, so about 10 minutes per side. And if you're at all unsure if they are cooked through, you can take the temperature just by inserting a meat thermometer into the side of it, and that would be the best way to check it. Now, you are going to want to make sure that these fully cool before slicing into them, particularly with any gluten-free bread products. If you cut into them too soon while they're still warm, they're going to be gummy inside. While the English muffins were cooling, I got started on the egg component for the breakfast sandwiches. And I find the easiest way to do this to be baking the egg mixture on a baking sheet. Now, I know this is not the case for everyone right now, but we have a ton of eggs. So I just kind of decide how many eggs I want per breakfast sandwich. I'm aiming for 2 for these, and I'm adding that amount of eggs to my blender and adding some salt and pepper, blending that on low, and then I'll just pour that into a parchment-lined baking sheet. If you want to increase the protein on these even more, you can cut back a little bit on the eggs and add in some cottage cheese in place of some of them. Those are baking in a 350-degree oven for about 15 to 20 minutes until the eggs are just cooked. I'm doing a mix of breakfast sandwiches with some sausage and some with some bacon. So I'm getting started on making my sausage mixture. I'm just using a pound of our ground pork, and I like to season it with a little bit of brown sugar, some ground sage, some salt, and I do a little bit of black pepper as well. I also do a little bit of chili flakes and just a tiny pinch of cloves. And then that all gets mixed together. You can also do maple syrup in place of the brown sugar. To cook the bacon, I'm adding all of the bacon that I need into a cast iron skillet, and you don't need to do this in one layer. If you layer it over top of each other, give it a stir a couple times, all of that bacon is going to cook pretty evenly, and it's kind of going to fry in its own fat. Now, instead of slicing cheese or using store-bought sliced cheese on the breakfast sandwiches, what I do is I'll shred some cheddar cheese and I just sprinkle that over top of the egg mixture as soon as it comes out of the oven, and it will melt a little bit just to adhere to the eggs. Never throw out your bacon grease. It will last a very long time in the fridge or the freezer. I always save that, especially with the price of butter right now. I am using our lard and bacon grease to cook a lot. In that same pan that I used for the bacon, I'm cooking up some sausage patties to use for the breakfast sandwiches, and I'm using about half of that sausage mixture for the sausage patties, and the other half I'm going to cook up and set aside to use in some high-protein breakfast biscuits that I'm going to be making. It's really important when making freezer breakfast sandwiches that you allow all of the ingredients to fully cool before you assemble them and put them into the freezer, just to make sure that you have no extra moisture in there. So while I was waiting on that to cool down, I got to forming my loaves of bread. The bread dough had been rising for about 4 hours. It had about doubled in size. So I split that in half, forming my loaves and transferring those to some parchment-lined loaf pans, and then I'll cover that and allow those to rise for another couple hours or so until they have reached the top of the Loaf pan. Now, for assembling the breakfast sandwiches, I'll cut the English muffins in half, add on one of those egg and cheese patties, along with some bacon or sausage, close them up, and they're ready to package. Once those are all assembled, you're going to want to wrap them in either parchment or foil. Today I'm using some parchment bags that I had to use up, and then I like to store them in a big baking dish that has a lid in the freezer. And what we'll do is just grab one out the night before, transfer it to the fridge, and they're really quick to heat up in the toaster oven. Another recipe that I'm making to stock up the freezer with for breakfast option are my high protein breakfast biscuits. So for these, I start out with Greek yogurt. I'm making a double batch of these today. And to that, I'm going to add a couple eggs. I do this all in one bowl, and you can really adjust the seasonings as you like. I like to add in some chili flakes, some salt, as well as garlic powder. And these also have a ton of ground flax in them, which is going to up the fiber content. Adding in some baking powder, and then I'm going to get that Greek yogurt and eggs all whisked together with those spices and the ground flax. And that's just going to make sure that everything is evenly distributed before I add in the flour. I like to make these with oat flour to keep them gluten-free, but these absolutely can be made with all-purpose flour or whole wheat flour. I'm getting that all mixed together before I add in the final ingredients. Now, to increase the protein even more, I like to do some sort of meat. Today, I'm doing some ground sausage that I had left over from the sausage patties that I used for the breakfast sandwiches yesterday, but I've used diced ham or bacon in these as well. The great thing about these is that they're super customizable. I just make them with whatever veggies I have on hand. Today, that is a ton of onion and a ton of diced peppers. I've made these with broccoli, ham and cheese, bacon, mushrooms, and kale, all sorts of things. I'll just kind of use whatever I have on hand. Now, because I used a ton of peppers in these, I didn't have quite enough sausage, so I just bulked up the amount that I was missing with more veggies. These turned out a little bit flatter than they typically do, just because all of those veggies had a higher water content, but they still turn out great. I'm also adding in some shredded sharp cheddar cheese, and I'm saving a little bit of that aside to put on top of the biscuits before I bake them. Now, there are a couple different ways that you can form them. Sometimes I'll just sprinkle out a little bit more oat flour, press this out, and slice it into squares. Today I'm just using an ice cream scoop, super easy to do and a little bit faster. Once I have those all scooped out, I like to press them down a little bit and then top them off with some shredded cheese, and then those are going to bake in the oven. These store really well in both the fridge and the freezer. I often include these in my weekly meal prep, and I'm going to have those in the freezer. I can just pull one out, pop it into the toaster oven, and I'll have a healthy breakfast option really quickly. What I love about these is that they're high in protein, but they don't really taste like it, so it's a great thing to have on hand if you're not craving protein, but you still want to make sure you get it in. For a snack option, I'm making up a batch of freezer smoothies. These are great because they thaw relatively quickly within just a couple hours, and you can just shake them up and you've got a smoothie ready to go. So for this batch, I'm just doing a ton of frozen mixed berries. I also added in a little bit of frozen banana to sweeten this up a little bit. And for the liquid component, I'm using coconut milk. but you can also use Greek yogurt in these to up the protein content. I don't love using protein powder in these. I don't find that it works that well, but I do like to use collagen peptides in them. I'll leave the ones that I like to use in the description box down below. They are pasture raised and glyphosate residue free, just really high quality. I'm keeping these pretty simple, but oftentimes I'll add in things like bee pollen for more B vitamins or some spinach to add in some greens. I freeze these in wide mouth pint jars. I've never had one break. You just want to make sure that you leave plenty of headspace. About 1.5 inches is usually what I do, and you're going to want to avoid using a regular mouth jar that has a shoulder. My granola cookie recipe is also something that freezes really well. They're kind of like a granola bar in cookie form. They are naturally gluten-free and they are refined sugar-free. So I start out with some nut butter. I typically will use peanut butter, but you could substitute in almond butter or cashew butter if that's what you prefer. And to sweeten these, I'm using some pure maple syrup, but honey also works well here. A little bit of vanilla extract, and then I get all of those liquid ingredients mixed together before I add in the oats, the nuts, and the seeds. I'm adding in a little bit of baking soda and salt, stirring that together again, and then I'm adding my oats. If you need these to be gluten-free, just be sure to use certified gluten-free oats. I like to do a little bit of chia seeds for some fiber. You can also substitute in some ground flaxseed here or even whole flaxseed. And then for the nuts and seeds, you can really interchange these with whatever you like. So today I'm doing some sunflower seeds, and then I'm doing some chopped almonds. I'm also adding in some raisins that I dehydrated last year and just a little bit of mini dark chocolate chips. Mix that together until a dough forms, and these are ready for the oven. I like to portion these using a 1.5 tablespoon cookie scoop, and these can be placed pretty close together on the baking sheet. They aren't going to spread much, and I just use my fingers to press down the tops, and then those are ready to bake. My main goal today was getting some breakfast and snack options into the freezer, but I did also want to have some dinner options on hand. So I'm going to be doing some sweet potato shepherd's pie, or technically I guess this is a cottage pie. And to start out with that, I'm just peeling up a bunch of sweet potato, getting those into a pot, and I'm going to bring those up to a boil for about 10 minutes. While those sweet potatoes were going, I got my skillet heating up, and I'm dicing up a bunch of yellow onion and mincing a bunch of garlic and setting that aside. Some of that is going to be for this recipe, a little bit is going to be for the next recipe that I'm making. To my skillet, I added a little bit of lard just so that the beef doesn't stick when I add that in there. and I'm going to be cooking up 2 pounds of beef. Now you can, if you want to stretch this a little bit further, add in some cooked lentils. That's going to add some fiber and just make this go a little bit further. So I'm just getting that browned, and then I'll go ahead and add in the onions, the garlic, and the seasonings. At this point, the sweet potatoes were ready to be drained off, and I just set those aside. Once the beef was mostly cooked through, I added in that onion and garlic and allowed that to soften a little bit before adding in my seasonings. Now for seasonings today, I did some black pepper. I also did some dried oregano, some paprika, a little bit of salt, and I also added in some dried thyme. Allowed that to continue cooking, and then I added in a couple tablespoons of tomato paste along with a little bit of broth, and that's going to kind of make a little bit of a gravy on this. Now for veggies, you can do whatever you want. You can do just peas. Often I'll do fresh carrots. Today, just for ease, I did a few cups of a frozen veggie blend and allowed that to finish cooking. These sweet potatoes are going to get mashed up and become the topping for this shepherd's pie. And to them, I'm adding in just a little bit of butter and some salt and pepper. I was originally thinking that I would split this into some smaller containers, but just with freezer space, I decided to split this into 2 9x9 pans, and this will end up making us dinner for a few nights. So I'll just pull these out of the freezer the night before, let them thaw in the fridge, and then they'll bake in the oven. For another easy dinner option, I'm making up some pasta sauce, and for this I'm using 2 pounds of ground beef, allowing that to brown in my big Dutch oven. And then I'm going to add in a ton of garlic and some red onion. I really like having this in the freezer, and it's something that I'll often make a larger batch of when I'm cooking, just to put a little bit away. That way I can pull it out the night before, allow it to thaw, and then for dinner, all I need to do is either roast up a spaghetti squash or boil some pasta. After the onion and garlic had softened a little bit, this was ready for some herbs. So I did some dried basil as well as some dried oregano. And I have a ton of garlic scape powder that I made last year, so I ended up adding that in as well, just for a little bit more garlic flavor. Allowed that to continue cooking. I did also add in some salt and pepper, and then I'm adding in a ton of veggies to this to really make this stretch. I still have a lot of frozen peppers from the garden last year, so I added in a couple cups of that, allowed that to cook, and then I did about a pound of diced mushrooms as well. For the tomato sauce, I'm just using a couple of these 1.5 pint jars of my roasted tomato sauce that I made last year from the garden. It is just plain roasted tomatoes. They have a ton of flavor. Added that into the pot, and I allowed that to simmer for a little bit until the flavors developed. I split that into 4 containers, and that's going to give us dinner for at least 4 nights. As we approach the warmer months, I really like to have some marinated chicken in the freezer. So I, the day before, thawed a couple of our whole chickens that we raised, and I parted those out, and I'm going to be doing 2 different marinades today. The first marinade that I'm making is a Greek style, and for this I'm doing a bunch of fresh lemon juice, some garlic, and some dried thyme. I'm also adding in a little bit of Dijon mustard, some salt, and some olive oil. The nice thing about having marinated chicken in the freezer is that it's going to marinate as the chicken thaws, and it's just going to have a ton of great flavor. For the second marinade, I'm using some olive oil, a little bit of tamari. I'm also doing some fresh lemon in here, and a little bit of balsamic vinegar. I'm also adding in lots of garlic, a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper, a bit of Worcestershire sauce. I know that I'm probably saying that wrong, and I will continue to do so. And then a little bit of brown sugar as well. Again, I'm using my baking dishes with the lids, great for freezing, and that way I can just thaw these, bake it right in the oven if we decide not to grill. I divided those 2 chickens into the 4 baking dishes. I did some with just breasts and some with thighs and the drumsticks. That wraps up today's video. Thank you for joining me in the kitchen as I restock my freezer. These meals are going to be great to have on hand to grab from throughout the busy months.